was a rainy night, and the streets were wet and dark under the pale light of the lanterns. I was driving home, hands shaking on the steering wheel of my car, feeling uneasy about the weather and the premonition haunting me. Raindrops hit the windshield with an infectious fury, and the wind whistled menacingly through the trees. There was that sinister atmosphere in the air, when the world seems to be covered by a dark veil. As I was walking home in the pouring rain, I took part in a terrible scene. In an instant, the light of a blinding flash illuminated the street, and I saw swirling shadows. It was a gruesome murder, and the murderer, a black, faceless figure, disappeared into the darkness of the night. Without thinking, I jumped out of the car and ran towards the victim, my heart beating wildly. It was a young and innocent woman, lying on the asphalt, staring at me with empty, lifeless eyes. I tried to give first aid, to do anything, but it was too late. Death had set its mark upon her, and I was the only witness to this ghastly scene. At that moment, I was surrounded by law enforcement, armed and ready to apply the law to me. Without any explanation, they accused me of that horrible crime. I had no chance to defend myself. They thought I was the murderer, even though I was absolutely innocent. It was an error, an unexpected nightmare. They handcuffed me and took me to the police station while the cold rain pierced my clothes and my soul. Accused of a crime I did not commit and sentenced to prison, I was thrown into a dark and cold cell with no hope of escape. All my prayers to the gods seemed to dissipate in the night wind, and I was left to acquaint myself with the stigmata of this invented crime. That night, my soul was imprisoned in a prison, and little did I know that this would only be the beginning of a much more sinister nightmare. After 24 hours of detention, I was released for lack of evidence. I felt drained of all hope, but I refused to be defeated by this injustice. I went to the crime scene to dig deeper and find clues to prove my innocence. But as before, everything was shrouded in dark mystery. As I carefully surveyed the crime scene, I noticed a surveillance camera mounted on a nearby pole. It was a crucial clue that I overlooked on that panic-filled night. With my heart beating wildly, I contacted the owner of the surveillance camera, hoping that the footage on that camera would reveal the gruesome truth. Indeed, what I saw in the video footage left me speechless. At that moment, I saw the dark shadow that had accused me of murder. It was a sinister apparition, a fearsome entity that moved in defiance of all the laws of physics. Inexplicably, the shadow appears to transform into a dark cloud, enveloping the victim before disappearing with them into the darkness. I couldn't believe what I had seen. My hands were shaking and my soul was caught in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. How could such a being exist? Where was he disappearing? The truth was more shocking than I had ever imagined. However, now I had a chance to prove my innocence. With the video footage as evidence, I immediately contacted my lawyer and the authorities, explaining the situation. However, even with clear evidence that I was not the murderer, the parties involved did not seem interested in investigating this strange and sinister situation in depth. I was trapped in a nightmare from which I could not escape. Not only had the mysterious shadow accused me of a crime I hadn't committed, but it seemed to be a terrifying danger to everyone around it. Questions remained unanswered, and my future seemed more uncertain and threatening than ever. The prison was now just a pale memory compared to what awaited me in the outside world, where the shadow seemed to have control over our lives. Terrified and overcome with fear, I desperately made my way home, leaving behind the scene of the crime and the sinister shadow that seemed to haunt my life. Upon arriving home, I tried to calm myself down, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the image of that horrible crime out of my mind. The food I had prepared for dinner was left untouched on the plate, the bitter taste of my innocence clouding my senses. At night, after having difficulty falling asleep because of the thoughts haunting me, I was awakened by a loud scream that pierced the night air. I hurriedly got up and looked out the window, and what I saw there froze me in place. In the middle of the street, under the pale light of the lanterns, lay another woman helpless. Beside her, the same sinister shadow seemed to hover, enveloping the scene in its evil darkness. At that moment, I realized the earth-shattering truth. I was witnessing these horrific crimes, and the shadow seemed to be looking for innocent victims. Fear shot through me from head to toe, feeling completely powerless in the face of this evil force. Instead of feeling safe in my own home, I realized I was in danger, that every shadow, every muffled sound, could be the last thing I saw or heard. Determined to do something about this situation, I began investigating these sinister crimes on my own. I've gathered all the information I could find about the mysterious shadow and its victims. However, the deeper I delved into the mysteries of this entity, the more aware I became of its incomprehensible power and evil. At one point, I heard desperate knocks on the front door. The first reaction was one of shock and concern. No one was to know that I was in the house investigating these strange occurrences. However, curiosity and compassion drove me to look through the peephole on the door. I saw a young and frightened woman with her face buried in her hands and crying in a heartbreaking way. It was as if I was looking for a thread of hope in her tearful eyes. Then her desperate voice broke through the door and begged me to let her into the house. On an impulse, I opened the door, allowing him to enter. The girl was shivering with cold and fear. Her eyes were red, and her cheeks were swollen from crying. With a trembling voice, she told me her name was Sarah, and that she was one of the victims of the sinister shadow. She had been attacked by this mysterious entity and had miraculously escaped alive. She was hurt and traumatized, and now she sought shelter and protection in my home. I tried to get more information from her, but she was in a state of shock and couldn't give much detail. She was just telling me that the shadow seemed to have an obsession with her, and that it followed her every night, despite all the measures she had taken to hide. At that moment, I realized that I was not the only one haunted by the sinister shadow, and that it was far more evil and terrifying than I had ever imagined. I tried to calm her down, give her shelter and some comfort. While he recovered a little from his shock, we sat in the living room in a silence charged with tension and mystery. As she talked about the repeated attacks of the sinister shadow, we tried to understand how we could deal with this threat. Despite the fear that gripped us both, we tried to come up with a plan to protect ourselves. We wondered what connection she had with this evil entity and why she was being attacked so fiercely. In the middle of this conversation, the rain continues to beat furiously on the windows, as if nature itself recognized the terror that reigned in our souls. At one point, as we struggled to make sense of our situation, a sinister voice shrouded in darkness was heard in the room. The sound was too scary to explain or understand. It seemed to come from all directions, an ominous presence that surrounded us. We looked at each other, feeling that the moment of truth was near. The sinister shadow was now very near, and I realized that this house was no safe haven against it. Panicked, we decided to leave the house in a hurry. We jumped in the car and sped off, our hearts pounding wildly in our chests, desperately searching for answers and a safe place to hide. The torrential rain continued to fall incessantly, as if the sky itself was weeping for our fate. Splashes of water hit the windshield with a violence that seemed to reflect the storm brewing deep within our souls. As we headed into the unknown, we tried to discuss our strategy for dealing with the sinister threat. It was clear that we needed answers and protection, and that we couldn't keep running forever. However, until we found those answers, we felt like we were in a race against time. At one point, in the middle of this storm that surrounded us, I lost control of the wheel. It was as if the car had been possessed by an evil force. I tried to steer the vehicle safely, but the car began to veer toward the side of the road at a frightening rate. Every effort to regain control seemed futile, and the precipice loomed menacingly closer. With a desperate cry, we braced ourselves for the impending impact. It was as if fate itself had turned against us, and the howls of the torrential rain mingled with the howls of our souls. The impact was brutal, and our car rolled down the steep slope, hitting rocks and trees as we felt thrown in all directions. The pain was overwhelming, and the world seemed to spin around us in a maelstrom of metal and confusion. When everything stopped, we stood still for a few moments, trying to recover. We had cuts and bruises, but miraculously, we were both alive. Our car was a heap of wrecked beasts, a testament to the violence of the impact. It was as if an evil force threw us into the abyss in an attempt to stop us from seeking the truth. As we tried to extricate ourselves from the wrecked car, we noticed that the torrential rain had turned into a soft, gentle drizzle. It was as if nature itself had decided to stop the storm at this critical moment. With the last of our strength, we managed to get out of the car. We were breathing hard and the light rain was falling quietly, contrasting with the chaos that had surrounded us before impact. It was as if nature understood the gravity of our situation and offered us a moment of respite. In silence, we made our way to the impact site and looked at what was left of our car. With a shudder of horror, I noticed that the car had caught fire and exploded in an infernal fire. The flames danced wildly in the rain, consuming everything in their path. In the midst of the fire, I saw that sinister force rise into the sky. It was a frightening sight, with light and darkness fighting to gain control over her. In that moment, I understood that the truth about the sinister shadow was much more complicated and frightening than I had ever thought. This was not just an evil force. It was supernatural in nature, an entity that escaped the laws of physics and human reason. And yet, as I witnessed that terrifying scene, I knew that the truth was now hidden forever in the dark shadows of our universe. Hearts heavy with sadness, we took Sarah in our arms and left, knowing that our chances of stopping or truly understanding the sinister shadow were nil. Our fate seemed sealed, and the menacing presence of the shadow haunted us forever. In the light and darkness of that night, I lost all hope and realized that we were just helpless pawns in a sinister story with no end and no redemption.